Hello, this is Anna Ellis. I'm going to be doing my project on my mom, Svetlana Valentinovna Batafonova, and I will be focusing in on her perspectives on Soviet and post-Soviet politics and the war in Ukraine. That's her in the middle, and then some other photos of her with her family. As an introduction, again, I interviewed my mom, Svetlana Valentinovna Batafonova Ellis, who was born in 1971. She's the mom to my sister Natasha and I, and she currently lives in Newport Beach, California. Our interview was approximately 2 hours on a FaceTime since I'm not home. And we discussed her background and her timeline in different places that she's lived, and kind of the connections between different political things that were happening in the Soviet Union and afterwards, and then also her shift in her political perspectives during her time living in the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of Putin, and then the war in Ukraine. Here is a visual of her timeline. She was born on April 11th, 1971 in the Baikal region of Siberia to her parents, Ludmila and Valentin Montafonova. After about 4 years, she moved to Moscow, where her dad's work as a military doctor meant that he was transferred to become the head surgeon at a big hospital there. Then again, he was moved to Hungary to work at a Soviet military base there. So she spent her later teenage years living in the Soviet part of Hungary. Then in 91 was the collapse of the USSR. A little bit after that, she started college and she met my dad studying in Hungary. She moved to the US in 96 with my dad, but she also visited Russia for about 2 months out of the year, every summer, every year since then. And in 99, Putin gains power, and we'll talk about that more later as well. Growing up in the USSR, so this is the period between 70 and 89, she expressed that she loved the USSR, she loved being a part of it. This was, of course, fueled by propaganda in the media and in schooling. And ultimately, this was a widespread shared belief of support towards communism and nationalism. She was under the impression that discrimination and inequality were rampant in the US, whereas everyone in the USSR is equal. However, it's pretty clear that it's possible that discrimination and inequality did exist in the US, but also there were a lot of other issues in the USSR as well. And also the big paradox here is that while she did believe this and did have a love for the USSR, she often wondered why Western popular culture like fashion, food, movies, and music was superior to the pop culture existent in the USSR, which wasn't very much. And, you know, she tried Coca-Cola for the first time as a kid and would see people on the streets wearing like acid wash jeans, which they didn't really necessarily have access to. You can see down here, this is kind of the clothing that they would have to wear, and they had very limited options and oftentimes had very like bad quality. Whereas if you happen to know someone foreign or had parents in a position where they were able to go abroad, they would often come back wearing Western clothing, and she often would look at those things with envy. Here we have some propaganda kind of depicting America as a place of inequality and discrimination, in which case it definitely was. And this was ultimately used to grow nationalism in the USSR. Next is the collapse of the Soviet Union between 89 and 91. Ultimately, Svetlana's attitude towards the collapse was positive. She supported Gorbachev and integration with the West. She also thought that other people supported this transition. Communism was ultimately already on its way out. After the war in Afghanistan, there were sanctions that ultimately destroyed the Soviet economy. So people were pretty much ready for a change. We also had the death of the former leader Brezhnev. And ultimately, immediately following the collapse, she says that her most memorable change was that the 10th grade history exam was canceled. That was the biggest change for her in her life. And ultimately, she just realized that everything that she was learning in her history classes was not necessarily true, and ultimately to strengthen the self-image of the Soviet Union. Next is the post-USSR / pre-Putin era, which would be 91 to 99. Ultimately, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was political and economic instability, which gave rise to mafia and crime. And as a result of all of these things, there was a fear that the communists would take over again. Ultimately, the first elected president, Boris Yeltsin, was able to run on a platform that was anti-communist, which landed him the presidency. He did, however, participate in economic mismanagement and corruption, and created a change in the constitution to increase the presidential powers. And in order to protect himself legally, he chose Vladimir Putin as his successor in exchange for protection against these criminal charges. So again, Putin was not elected democratically. And while her attitude towards Putin at first was positive, these things changed later on. Ultimately, though, the international community also supported Putin at first. He was friendly with the West. He even wanted to become a NATO member at one point, and the West also wanted to invest in Russia. So there's a lot of foreign money pouring into Russia. Russia was able to make money off of their large amounts of gas and oil. And this turning point that we have can sometimes be characterized by the speech he made at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he expressed that he wished for a bipolar world, and he believed that the US was too much of a superpower and wanted that to change. And that's him at the Munich Security Conference, and then that's him fishing and shown in a positive light, which a lot of the Russian population aspired to. The rise of Putin from 2007 onwards, this is where Svetlana's change in her attitude was the most apparent. 2013, the Russian parliament made a law that banned Americans from adopting Russian children. My mom was very suspicious of this law. She had never really questioned Putin before and was not too involved in Russian politics. However, she kind of got into this spiral investigating this law once she realized that it was in response to an American law that punished several Russians for killing a lawyer that discovered large sums of money that was laundered by the Russian government. So ultimately, this law showed her that there was corruption happening, and she started asking a lot of questions like, why were police in Russia driving Mercedes? How could they afford that when even in the US, the police here don't drive that expensive of a car? And also she was asking questions like, why are Russian politicians so rich? Where are they getting this money? So ultimately, these questions led her to a lot of answers that suggested the corrupt nature of the Russian government and Putin. She became involved in political activism throughout this time. She started listening to the Echo of Moscow radio station, which she's still a huge fan of. And ultimately, this is the only free media that still exists in Moscow. However, it did get shut down, I think, yesterday as a result of the Ukraine crisis, which I'll get into. But she also started supporting the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who is running his platform against Putin and is honestly amassing a pretty large following. He's the most prominent opposition leader to date since the installment of Putin as president. Here we have pictures of the Mercedes police cars that police in Russia use. Here's a logo for Radio Echo Moskva or Echo of Moscow, and then Alexei Navalny is up here as well. Putin's regime. This is kind of what the regime has been summarized as by my mom. Ultimately, a big characteristic is media propaganda, state-controlled news. There's also restrictions and surveillance on the internet. So ultimately limiting people's ability to see information and resist. And then we also have really poor education. This is a quote directly from her: "Smart people are bad for propaganda." We also have pretty bad healthcare. Centralized healthcare in Russia is terrible, according to her. Putin has also lied about the total COVID deaths and does not want to give accurate figures of how many people have been affected by COVID in Russia. We also have most of the government funding going towards security, so military and police, secret police targeting anyone who speaks out against Putin's regime, especially now with the Ukraine crisis. And ultimately, my mom says that she's more afraid of the current secret police compared to during the USSR. There's a protest surrounding Navalny, the opposition leader, in which Putin has thrown him in jail for, trying to gain political backing, showing that Putin is unwilling to have anyone stand in his way for his power. Here's a book, Putin's Kleptocracy. A kleptocracy is basically someone that steals the country that they rule's resources. And it's an interesting book about the corruption that's occurring in Russia as a result of Putin today. Next, I'll go on to the Ukraine crisis. This is ultimately summed up by Putin's power hunger and need for an empire. The propaganda that he's spewing out is that everyone is punishing Russians. This is characterized as a military mission to make peace in Ukraine as opposed to a war. He claims that there's only 4 deaths. He claims that there's only fighting in one city. And he also claims that Ukraine is filled with Nazis and fascists and that Russia is saving the world by invading Ukraine. The projections for the Ukraine crisis, according to my mom, she believes that there will be retaliation against Putin, which will come from the economic sanctions that lead to poverty. People are going to get fed up with not having much as a result of these sanctions. And also, a lot of people are going to realize that these heavy restrictions on opposition or speaking out against Putin are really, really hurtful for the country. They can land you 12 to 20 years in prison, which is ridiculous. Soldiers are not returning home from war. People are wondering where they are because he's lying about the deaths. Once people find out that not only he lied about the deaths, but that, there's upwards of nearly 5,000 people at this point that have died in the conflict, I think that people are going to start to get very angry. Here's a quote that she said, "My son is dead and I have nothing to eat." So those types of people are going to stand up against Putin, hopefully, in the future. And also there's going to be restrictions on travel, she thinks, and Russia could look like the next North Korea if it puts up the Iron Curtain and blocks communication with the outside world, which could potentially happen, especially now with the economic sanctions and the strict media surveillance that's going on. So this is honestly a global fight. This is not just between Ukraine and Russia. Other countries are getting involved. It's a fight between corruption and the free world. Putin has meddled in the affairs of other countries. He's paying off nationalist leaders from other countries like France and Hungary, attempting to destroy democracy from the inside out. However, his big mistake here is that as a result of the Ukraine crisis, Western countries are uniting against him. We can see that in not only the US's actions, but also Germany agreeing to suffer economically, Switzerland taking action to freeze the bank accounts of Russian oligarchs, which it's a huge surprise for Switzerland, given that they haven't taken any sort of political stance on an international issue since 1889. And even China is showing disapproval. So yes, people are coming together as a result of this. We have some photos here. Putin is ultimately making a mistake here, and it's going to affect him big time, but hopefully help the Russian people. And here he is at a table, I think speaking to his economic advisors, and he's sitting very far away from them, probably not wanting to hear what's going on with the economy. This last slide is on the personal impacts experienced by my mom. This is actually going to be the first year that she plans not to return to Russia since moving to the US over 25 years ago. She has this intense fear of getting arrested for online political activism. She does not know when it will be safe to return. She also has an aging mother, my grandma Ludmila, pictured here. She suffers from dementia and schizophrenia, and we're also her only immediate family. And she's unable to take care of herself and refuses to move to the US. She works very poorly with others, so it's going to be really difficult trying to find caregivers for her, given that there's a very poor market for that in Russia as well. She fears that the American money that she has in the bank in Russia, which is approximately $35,000, will get taken by the government. There's a shortage of American dollars, and she's worried that they're just going to reach in there and get it. She distrusts the Russian healthcare system and treatment of elderly. She doesn't know who to trust with her mom. and she is unsure if she'll ever see her mother again, or when this conflict will end, when it will be safe to return, and whether or not she has enough time to see her mom. So ultimately, that was a summary, I guess, of the conversation that I had with my mom. She is very, very passionate about this subject. So if anyone has any more questions about it, feel free to reach out to me, and thank you for listening.